Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the secrets that lie hidden in familiar landscapes. We all have places we think we know. The local park, the patch of woods behind our childhood home, the quiet country lane we drive down every day. They are the backdrop to our lives, so constant and so known that we cease to see them with fresh eyes. But these familiar places have histories that stretch back long before us. And sometimes, they hold secrets that are dark, patient, and waiting to be found. The stories we're delving into tonight are about the moment that familiar ground gives way, revealing a hidden history and a crime that has been silently waiting in the shadows. We'll be journeying to a forgotten corner of the English countryside, a place where a child's game led to a discovery that would launch a mystery that has endured for 80 years. A mystery that whispers of witchcraft, espionage, and murder. It's a case that reminds us that you never truly know the ground beneath your feet. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to look out your window into the darkness. Think about the history of the land your home sits on, the stories that might be buried just out of sight. It's in that space between the known and the unknown that our story begins. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to dig into these deep, unresolved histories with us. It helps this community grow and allows these complex stories to be shared. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It is a profound experience to see our community of late-night historians gathered from all corners of the globe. Now let the room grow quiet. Let's begin our journey. Who put Bella in the witch elm? The spring of 1943 was a time of profound anxiety and weary resolve in Great Britain. The nation was deep in the throes of the Second World War. The nights were dark with mandatory blackouts. Food and resources were strictly rationed, and the ever-present threat of air raids was a part of daily life. In the quiet, rural county of Worcestershire, nestled in the English Midlands, life was far from the front lines, but the war was still a constant, looming presence. It was in this atmosphere of national tension and uncertainty that four young boys decided to escape the boredom of a Sunday afternoon by venturing into the woods. The place they chose was Hagley Wood, a dense, private woodland that was part of the sprawling estate of Lord Cobham. For local boys, the woods were a place of adventure and illicit fun, a perfect spot for a bit of poaching. On the afternoon of April 18, 1943, four friends, Robert Hart, Thomas Willits, Bob Farmer, and Fred Payne, set out in search of bird nests, a common pastime and a way to supplement their family's meager wartime rations with a few fresh eggs. As they moved deeper into the woods, they came across a particularly large and ominous-looking tree. It was a wych elm, a species known for its gnarled, twisted branches and imposing stature. The tree was old and looked almost menacing, the kind of tree that would be at home in a fairy tale. It was this tree that Bob Farmer, the most adventurous of the group, decided to climb. He shimmied up the trunk, hoping to find a bird's nest in its upper branches. As he climbed, he peered down into the tree's dark, cavernous hollow trunk, and that's when he saw it. Staring back up at him from the darkness was a human skull. The eye sockets were empty and dark, and a few tufts of hair were still attached. A single, crooked tooth jutted from the upper jaw. For a moment, he thought it was an animal skull, but the human shape was undeniable. Terrified, he scrambled back down the tree to his friends. At first, they didn't believe him, but when he led them back and they all peered into the hollow, they saw it too. They were staring at human remains. The boys were gripped by a dual sense of terror and guilt. They were terrified by their gruesome discovery, but they were also afraid of getting into trouble. They were trespassing on private land and poaching, both of which were serious offenses. They made a pact of silence. They swore to each other that they would tell no one what they had found, that they would let the secret of the wych elm remain a secret. For a time, the pact held. But the weight of the discovery was too much for the youngest of the boys, Thomas Willits. The image of the skull haunted him. He was plagued by nightmares. Finally, unable to bear the secret any longer, he confessed what they had found to his father. His father, understanding the gravity of the situation, immediately contacted the Worcestershire County Police. The police arrived at Hagley Wood and were led to the gnarled wych elm. They began the grim task of excavating the contents of the hollow trunk. What they found transformed a simple case of discovered remains into a bizarre and enduring murder mystery. Inside the tree, they found an almost complete human skeleton, but it was the items found with the skeleton that began to tell a strange and disturbing story. They found remnants of clothing, including a cheap shoe and scraps of a fabric later identified as taffeta. They found a gold wedding ring. But the most significant and chilling discovery was a large piece of taffeta that had been crammed deep inside the skull's mouth. The remains were sent to a forensic expert, Professor James Webster of the Home Office. His analysis began to paint a clearer, though no less mysterious, picture of the victim. The skeleton belonged to a woman, likely between 35 and 40 years old. She had given birth at least once. She had distinctive, slightly crooked teeth, which would have been a key identifying feature. Professor Webster determined that she had been dead for at least 18 months, placing her time of death sometime in the autumn of 1941. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The piece of taffeta found in her mouth had not been swallowed accidentally. It had been deliberately and forcefully shoved there, choking her to death. This was not an accident or a suicide. This was a murder. But it was Professor Webster's final conclusion that elevated the case from a simple homicide to something deeply strange. Based on the positioning of the bones and the narrow confines of the tree hollow, he determined that the woman's body must have been placed inside the tree while it was still warm, before the onset of rigor mortis. A body that had gone stiff would have been impossible to fit into the space. This meant the killer had murdered her and then, within an hour or two of her death, had carried her body through the woods and sealed her inside the hollow trunk of the wych elm, creating a makeshift vertical tomb. The investigation into her identity began immediately, but the police were faced with a near impossible task. This was wartime. The country was in a state of flux. Millions of people were displaced, records were chaotic, and missing persons reports were overwhelming, particularly for women who might have left their homes to work in factories or follow soldiers. The police conducted a massive search of dental records from across the country, hoping to find a match for the victim's distinctive teeth. But they found nothing. They interviewed locals, but no one in the immediate area had been reported missing. It seemed the woman was not from Hagley. With no leads, no witnesses, and no identity for their victim, the case quickly went cold. The unknown woman in the wych elm seemed destined to become just another unsolved wartime mystery. A forgotten victim whose story would be lost to time. For over 6 months, there was only silence. The war raged on, and the gruesome discovery in the woods began to fade from public memory. But someone out there had not forgotten. Someone knew who she was, and they were about to begin a strange, anonymous campaign to ensure that no one else would forget her either. A campaign that would give the victim her name and turn a local murder into a national legend. The first piece of graffiti was about to appear, and with it, the haunting question that would define the case for the next 80 years. Who put Bella in the wych elm? For months following the discovery of the skeleton in Hagley Wood, the case went completely cold. The victim remained a Jane Doe, her distinctive dental features yielding no matches in the national records. The police had no suspects and no leads. The mystery seemed destined to be buried under the more pressing concerns of a nation at war. But just before Christmas of 1943, the case was abruptly and bizarrely resurrected. On a wall in the nearby town of Old Hill, a piece of graffiti appeared, scrawled in chalk in large, blocky letters. It read, "Who put Bella in the W elm?" The message was a shock to the police. It was the first time any name had been publicly associated with the unknown victim. The spelling was slightly different, but the core was there. Bella. Over the next few years, this question would become a recurring, ghostly presence throughout the English Midlands. The same phrase or variations of it, Hagley Wood Bella or simply Bella, appeared again and again, scrawled on walls and monuments in the surrounding towns. The most famous and enduring of these messages was painted on the Wychbury Obelisk, a prominent local landmark, where it remained for decades. It was a taunting, cryptic message, a public whisper from someone who clearly knew more than they were telling. Was it the killer, tormented by guilt and toying with the police? Or was it someone else who knew the victim's identity but was too afraid to come forward officially? The graffiti campaign gave the victim a name and transformed the case into a piece of enduring local folklore. The police now had a new line of inquiry. Who was Bella? They renewed their efforts, this time focusing on missing persons named Bella or Isabella who had disappeared around 1941. Despite this new focus, they still found no matches. The identity of the victim remained as elusive as the identity of the person writing the messages. The case remained largely dormant until 1953, a full decade after the body was found. The mystery took another strange turn when a woman named Una Mossop contacted the police with a remarkable story. She claimed that her late ex-husband, a man named Jack Mossop, had confessed to her that he had been involved in the woman's death. According to Una, Jack had been part of a small group, including a Dutchman named Van Ralt, that had been drinking at a local pub with a woman who was a Dutch national. The woman got drunk and passed out in their car. The men, in a panic, decided to teach her a lesson and put her in the hollow tree in Hagley Wood, believing she would wake up in the morning, frightened but unharmed. Una claimed that Jack was haunted by what he had done. She said he had recurring nightmares in which he would see the face of the woman staring out at him from inside the tree. He had been so tormented by these visions that he had eventually been committed to a mental institution, where he died before the body was ever discovered. The story seemed plausible. It explained the lack of violent injury, if they believed her to be alive, and it provided a potential identity for the victim, a Dutch woman who was not from the local area. However, there were inconsistencies. It didn't explain the piece of taffeta shoved in her mouth, a clear act of violence that suggested more than just a drunken prank. Furthermore, Una Mossop was seen as a somewhat unreliable witness, and with both Jack Mossop and Van Ralt deceased, her story could never be corroborated. The lead fizzled out. The case then lay cold for another 30 years, fading into a local legend, a ghost story told to children about the witch in the tree. But in the 1980s and 90s, new theories emerged that cast the murder in a completely different and far more sinister light, connecting it to the dark world of wartime espionage and black magic. One of the most prominent of these theories was developed by Donald McCormick, a historian who wrote about the case under the pseudonym Peter Tony Lavenda. McCormick proposed that Bella was a Dutch woman named Clarabella Dronkers, and that she had been part of a Nazi spy ring operating in the Midlands. The region was home to several munitions factories, making it a key target for German intelligence. According to this theory, Clarabella was a cabaret singer and a German agent who had been parachuted into the area. She was working with a British RAF officer who was a double agent. She knew too much about the spy ring's operations, and when she tried to defect or was deemed a liability, her own contacts decided to silence her permanently. The murder in this context was a professional execution. The method of disposal, placing her in the tree, was a way to ensure her body would not be found for a long time, if ever. This espionage theory gained more traction when declassified MI5 files from the war were released. The files revealed the interrogation of a man named Joseph Jacobs, a German spy who was the last man to be executed at the Tower of London. Jacobs was captured after parachuting into England in 1941. During his interrogation, he mentioned that his lover, a German cabaret singer and spy named Clara Bowley, was supposed to have parachuted into the Midlands a few months before him. He believed she was working as a spy in the area. The physical description of Clara Bowley was a near-perfect match for the forensic profile of the skeleton found in the Wych Elm. She was around 38 years old, had crooked teeth, and had worked as a singer in the West Midlands. However, there is no official record of Clara Bowley ever arriving in England, and a photograph of her, when compared to a speculative reconstruction of Bella's face, showed some dissimilarities. She remains a compelling person of interest, but the connection is not definitive. An even more bizarre theory connects the murder to local witchcraft and occult rituals. This theory, proposed by the anthropologist Margaret Murray, suggests that the murder was not a spy killing, but a ritual sacrifice. Murray pointed to the location of the body in a wych elm, a tree with significant associations with witchcraft and folklore. She also noted that one of the victim's hands had been severed and was found buried near the tree. In some forms of black magic, the hand of glory, the severed, preserved hand of a hanged man, was believed to be a powerful magical artifact. Murray theorized that Bella was a witch who had been executed by another coven in a ritual dispute. The placement of her body in the tree was a symbolic act within this magical context. This theory, while fascinating, has little concrete evidence to support it beyond the circumstantial details of the location and the severed hand. However, it taps into the deep, folkloric roots of the English countryside and provides a motive that is outside the realm of conventional criminal investigation. The identity of the person who wrote the graffiti also remains a mystery. For years, it was assumed to be a single person, but in the late 1990s, a local man came forward and admitted that he had been responsible for some of the later graffiti in the 1970s. He said he had been a student at the time and had become fascinated with the local legend, and he and his friends had repainted the message on the Witchbury obelisk as a kind of prank, to keep the story alive. This confession explains the longevity of the graffiti, but it doesn't explain who wrote the original messages in the 1940s. That person, the one who knew the name Bella from the very beginning, has never been identified. The case of who put Bella in the witch elm is a perfect storm of a mystery. It has all the elements of a classic whodunit, but it is layered with the intrigue of wartime espionage and the strange, otherworldly pull of occult folklore. Each theory is plausible in its own way, yet each lacks the definitive proof needed to solve the case. Was she a local woman killed in a crime of passion? A Dutch prostitute murdered by a client? A Nazi spy executed by her own handlers? Or a witch sacrificed in a dark ritual? Her skeleton, which had been held at the University of Birmingham for decades, mysteriously disappeared in the 1970s, making any further forensic analysis with modern DNA techniques impossible. The final key to her identity has been lost forever. All that remains is the haunting question, a piece of graffiti that has transcended its origins to become a permanent, chilling fixture in the landscape of English crime lore. Bella, whoever she was, remains a silent resident of the Witch Elm. Her story a tangled knot of history, folklore, and murder that will likely never be unraveled. The enduring mystery of Bella in the Witch Elm is a testament to the power of an unsolved crime to embed itself into the cultural landscape. In the decades following the initial investigation, the case has become more than just a cold case file. It has transformed into a piece of modern English folklore, a story that continues to evolve and attract new generations of investigators, historians, and amateur sleuths. The lack of a definitive solution has allowed the case to become a canvas onto which a variety of compelling, if unproven, narratives have been painted. The police investigation, for its part, officially remained open for decades but was largely inactive. Without a positive identification of the victim, progress was virtually impossible. The name Bella, provided by the mysterious graffiti writer, was their strongest lead, but it was also a frustratingly common one. Searches of missing persons records from the wartime period were a logistical nightmare. The chaos of the Blitz, the mass evacuations, and the constant movement of people across the country meant that records were often incomplete or lost. A woman with no strong local ties could easily disappear without anyone officially noticing for years. The most promising lead in recent years came not from a police investigation, but from a new book on the subject published in 2018 by author Andrew Spark. Spark conducted an exhaustive review of the case files and historical records, and put forward a new and highly plausible candidate for Bella's identity. His research pointed to a woman named Clarabella Dronkers, the same Dutch woman that historian Donald McCormick had suggested years earlier, but Spark provided more detailed and compelling circumstantial evidence. Spark's theory aligns with the espionage angle. He posits that Clarabella was indeed a German spy, part of a network operating in the Midlands. He suggests that her lover was a British RAF officer who was also a double agent. According to this narrative, Clarabella became a problem. Perhaps she was emotionally unstable, or perhaps she threatened to expose the spy ring. Her German handlers or her British co-conspirators decided she had to be eliminated. The murder was a professional hit, designed to be untraceable. Spark even identified a potential local accomplice, a man who worked as a driver and had connections to the criminal underworld, who could have helped dispose of the body. He argues that the method of placing her in the Witch Elm was not a random choice, but a deliberate act of concealment in a remote, private location where she was unlikely to be found. This spy theory is compelling because it neatly explains many of the case's most puzzling aspects. It explains why the victim was not a local, why no one reported her missing, and why she had distinctive but unrecorded dental work. It also provides a powerful motive for a murder that was clearly not a robbery or a simple crime of passion. The graffiti in this context could have been written by someone within the spy ring, perhaps a disillusioned member or someone who knew of Clarabella's fate and wanted to see some form of justice done without directly implicating themselves. However, despite the strength of the circumstantial evidence, the espionage theory remains unproven. There is no declassified government file that definitively places Clarabella Dronkers or Clara Bowerly in Hagley Wood. The story remains in the realm of well-researched speculation. The disappearance of Bella's skeleton from the University of Birmingham in the 1970s is another layer of mystery that has hampered any modern investigation. The loss of the remains means that advanced forensic techniques, such as isotopic analysis, can never be performed. Isotopic analysis of the teeth and bones could have determined the geographical region where Bella grew up, potentially confirming if she was from the Netherlands, Germany, or elsewhere in Europe. DNA testing could have been used to create a genetic profile to compare against living relatives, potentially leading to a positive identification. The loss of the skeleton, whether through a simple administrative error or a more deliberate act of concealment, means that the most crucial piece of evidence is gone forever. Today, the story of Bella in the Wych Elm lives on most vividly in the community around Hagley Wood. The Wychbury obelisk, where the most famous graffiti was painted, remains a site of local pilgrimage for those fascinated by the case. The question, who put Bella in the Wych Elm, has become a part of the local identity, a shared secret whispered in pubs and told around campfires. The case represents a perfect, unsolvable storm. It is a crime that occurred during a time of national chaos, making records and identification difficult. The victim was likely a transient or a foreigner with no local connections. The body was concealed so effectively that it was not discovered for nearly 2 years, by which time much of the forensic evidence had been lost to the elements. And the key piece of evidence that could have solved the mystery in the modern era, the skeleton itself, has vanished. What remains is the narrative, or rather, the competing narratives. Each one offers a different lens through which to view the crime. The story of the tragic local woman killed by a lover speaks to the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The story of the Nazi spy speaks to the hidden histories and secret wars that are fought in the shadows of our official one. And the story of the witch sacrificed in a dark ritual speaks to the ancient folklore and primal fears that still linger in the English countryside. Bella, whoever she truly was, has become a symbol. She is the eternal unknown victim, a woman whose life story was so completely erased that even her name is a mystery, given to her by a phantom graffiti writer. Her tomb was not a consecrated grave, but the dark, hollow heart of a gnarled old tree. Her case is a powerful and unsettling reminder that even when a body is found, it does not always mean the story is over. Sometimes, it's only the beginning of a question that will echo through the generations. A question scrawled in chalk on a wall, asking for a justice that can never be delivered, and for a name that will likely never be truly known. The Watcher House, the chilling case of Bella in the Wych Elm, is a story about a secret that was physically buried, hidden away in the heart of a tree. But some secrets aren't buried at all. They arrive in the mail. They are typed onto a page and slipped into an envelope, a campaign of psychological terror that turns the single safest place in a person's life, their home, into the source of their greatest fear. This is a story about a family's dream house that became the subject of a terrifying and anonymous obsession, a case where the threat was not a physical intruder, but a disembodied voice that called itself the Watcher. The story begins in June of 2014, in the affluent and idyllic suburban town of Westfield, New Jersey. Westfield is known for its beautiful homes, excellent schools, and quiet, tree-lined streets. It is consistently ranked as one of the safest and most desirable places to live in the state. It was this sense of safety and community that drew Derek and Maria Broaddus to the town. They had 3 young children and were looking for their forever home, a place to put down roots and build a life. They found what they believed to be the perfect house at 657 Boulevard. It was a beautiful, six-bedroom Dutch colonial home, built in 1905, with a large, welcoming porch and a sprawling backyard. It was the quintessential American dream house, situated in the heart of a perfect American suburb. The Broadduses were overjoyed. They purchased the home for $1.35 million and began making plans. They decided to do some minor renovations before moving their family in. They hired painters and contractors, and for the first few weeks, the house was a place of happy, hopeful activity. Just 3 days after closing on the house, Derek Broaddus went to check the mail. Inside the mailbox, among the welcome letters from neighbors and junk mail, was a single, thick, white envelope. It was addressed in clunky, handwritten block letters to the new owner. There was no return address. Curious, Derek opened it. Inside was a typed letter. The message began warmly enough. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. But the friendly tone quickly evaporated, replaced by something deeply unsettling and sinister. The author of the letter introduced themselves only as the Watcher. They claimed that their family had been watching the house for generations. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched in the 1960s. The letter stated, "It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out." The letter then took an even more terrifying turn, revealing that the author had not just been watching the house, but had been watching the Broaddus family themselves. "I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be." The letter continued, "Tisk tsk, a bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy." The Watcher then made it clear that their surveillance had been intimate and specific. "You have children. I have seen them. So far I think there are 3 that I have counted." The letter was filled with possessive, ominous language. The Watcher referred to the children as the young blood you have brought to me. The author asked if they had found what was in the walls yet, and ended with a chilling, open-ended threat. "Who am I? I am the Watcher and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. You will be happy to know that I am watching and waiting for the day the young blood will be mine again. Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin." Derek Broaddus was terrified. This was not a harmless prank. It was a deeply personal and threatening letter from someone who was clearly watching their every move. He immediately contacted the local police. The police were concerned but were also somewhat dismissive. They suggested it could be a joke played by a disgruntled neighbor or perhaps someone who had been outbid for the house. They advised the Broadduses not to tell anyone about the letter, fearing it could inspire copycats or cause unnecessary panic in the neighborhood. The Broadduses also contacted the previous owners of the house, John and Andrea Woods. They asked them if they had ever received such letters. The Woods family, who had lived in the house for 23 years, told them that in the week before they moved out, they too had received a single, strange letter from someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letter was odd but not overtly threatening, and they had simply dismissed it as a bizarre prank and thrown it away. They had not felt it was significant enough to disclose during the sale of the house. Shaken but determined to move forward, the Broadduses tried to put the letter out of their minds. They continued with their renovations, hoping it was an isolated incident. But 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. It was addressed to the Broadduses by name, though with a misspelling, and again the handwriting was clunky and hard to identify. The tone of this letter was even more menacing and detailed. The Watcher now seemed to know the names of their children and their birth order. "I am pleased to know your names now and the name of the young blood you have brought to me." The letter read, "Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream." The letter continued with more disturbing, personal details. "All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the one who watches you. The letter also made it clear that the writer was physically close by. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will pass by many times of the day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too Broadus family. The dream house had become a source of profound terror. Maria Broadus was so frightened that she refused to let her children even set foot in the house. Derek became obsessed with finding the source of the letters. He set up webcams, installed a new alarm system, and spent his nights watching the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person who was tormenting his family. He and Maria began to look at every neighbor with suspicion. Was it the eccentric family across the street? The quiet couple next door? The watcher could be anyone, and that was the most terrifying part. They were living in a state of siege, not by a physical threat, but by a psychological one. Their dream had curdled into a waking nightmare, and the letters had only just begun. The watcher had promised them a party, and it was clear it was a party from which they would never be able to escape. The arrival of the second letter transformed the Broadus family's experience from a disturbing incident into a full-blown psychological crisis. The watcher's knowledge of their children's names and their movements within the house proved that this was not a distant, casual observer. This was someone close by, someone who was actively and obsessively monitoring them. The idyllic suburban dream had become a terrifying panopticon. Derek and Maria Broadus made the difficult decision that they could not, under any circumstances, move their children into 657 Boulevard. The risk, both physical and psychological, was simply too great. Their dream home now sat empty, a monument to their fear, while they continued to live in their old house, paying the mortgage and property taxes on a home they were too afraid to inhabit. The investigation by the Westfield Police Department continued, but it was fraught with challenges. The letters themselves offered few forensic clues. They were typed, the envelopes were standard, and there was no usable DNA or fingerprint evidence. The case was a ghost hunt. The police investigation focused on the immediate neighborhood. They interviewed the neighbors, but everyone denied any knowledge of the letters. The police explored the theory that it could be a neighbor who was mentally disturbed or who had a grudge against the idea of a new family moving in and making renovations. One neighbor who drew suspicion lived directly behind 657 Boulevard. His family had lived in the area for decades, fitting the generational timeline described by the watcher. However, when questioned, he denied any involvement, and police could find no evidence to link him to the letters. Another theory centered on a different family who lived across the street. Their house had a direct line of sight into the Broadus home, and they were known for being somewhat eccentric. But again, interviews and investigation led nowhere. The problem was that anyone in the dense, close-knit neighborhood could be the watcher. The letters had successfully sown a deep and pervasive sense of paranoia, turning a friendly community into a web of potential suspects. Frustrated with the pace of the official investigation, Derek Broadus launched his own obsessive inquiry. He became a man consumed by the need to unmask his tormentor. He spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, former FBI profilers, and security systems. He set up motion-activated cameras around the property, hoping to catch someone approaching the mailbox. He spent countless hours poring over the letters, dissecting every word and phrase, searching for a hidden clue to the author's identity. One of the private investigators suggested a chilling possibility, that the watcher might not be a neighbor at all, but someone who lived inside the walls of 657 Boulevard itself. The letter's cryptic reference to what lies within the walls took on a terrifying new meaning. Was it possible that a previous owner, or perhaps a disgruntled contractor, had built a secret room or a hidden vantage point from which to observe the home's occupants? This theory, while sounding like something from a horror movie, was taken seriously enough that the house was thoroughly searched for any hidden passages or spaces. Nothing was found. The Broaduses also began to look into the history of the house and its previous owners, the Woods family. Could the watcher be someone with a grudge against the Woods family, who was now transferring that obsession onto the new owners? This seemed plausible, especially since the Woods had received a single letter themselves just before they moved. The Broaduses hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit against the Woods family, claiming they had a legal obligation to disclose the letter they had received, arguing that had they known about the threat, they never would have bought the house. The lawsuit became a bitter and public affair, further fracturing the neighborhood and adding a layer of legal stress on top of the family's psychological torment. The Woods family maintained that they had considered the single letter they received to be a harmless prank and had no idea that it would escalate into a terrifying campaign of harassment. A few months after the first two letters, a third letter arrived. This one was even more menacing. "Where have you gone to?" it taunted. 657 Boulevard is missing you. The letter seemed to express anger that the Broadduses had not yet moved in, as if their absence was depriving the watcher of their source of entertainment. The dream house had become a trap, and the family was now being punished for not walking into it. As the months turned into a year, the financial and emotional strain on the Broaddus family became unbearable. They were paying the mortgage on a multimillion-dollar house they couldn't live in, while also paying for their old home. They decided they had no choice but to try and sell 657 Boulevard. But this presented a new and difficult dilemma. They felt they had a moral and legal obligation to disclose the existence of the watcher letters to any potential buyers. When they did, a predictable thing happened. No one wanted to buy the house. Potential buyers would fall in love with the beautiful home, only to back out in terror after reading the letters. The house was now notorious, its market value plummeting. The watcher had not only stolen the family's dream, they had trapped them in a financial nightmare. In a desperate and controversial move, the Broadduses proposed a plan to the town's planning board. They wanted to tear down the existing house and subdivide the large property into two smaller lots, on which they could build two new homes. Their hope was that two new, modern homes would be easier to sell and might break the stigma associated with the original house. This plan, however, was met with fierce opposition from the neighbors. The neighbors on the quiet, historic street did not want the large, beautiful property to be split. They worried it would change the character of their neighborhood and lower their own property values. The planning board meeting was a tense and emotional affair, with the Broadduses pleading their case on one side and their angry neighbors on the other. In the end, the planning board voted against their proposal. The Broaddus family was trapped, unable to live in their home, unable to sell it, and unable to change it. The case had become a national media sensation, a modern suburban horror story that played on the deepest fears of every homeowner. The identity of the watcher was a subject of intense public speculation. Was it a jealous neighbor, a former housekeeper or contractor with a grudge, a mentally ill person obsessed with the house? Or was it, as some online sleuths suggested, a marketing hoax created by the Broadduses themselves to get out of a house they could no longer afford? This last theory, while popular with some, was strongly refuted by the family and law enforcement, who could find no evidence of a hoax and noted the very real and devastating financial and emotional toll the ordeal had taken on the family. The police investigation, despite its best efforts, eventually went cold. They had investigated every neighbor, looked into the town's history, and even conducted a limited DNA analysis on one of the envelopes, which pointed to a female contributor. But the sample was not robust enough to be conclusive. The watcher remained a phantom, a ghost in the machine of suburban life. The letters had stopped, but the silence was just as unnerving as the threats. The watcher was still out there, somewhere in the quiet, leafy town of Westfield, watching and waiting. For the Broaddus family, the nightmare was far from over. They still owned the house, a house that had become a prison of fear and a source of financial ruin, all because of a series of anonymous letters from a person who claimed to be its eternal, obsessive guardian, trapped in a legal, financial, and psychological nightmare. The Broaddus family felt they had run out of options. They were unable to live in their home, and the intense media scrutiny and the obligation to disclose the threatening letters made selling it through traditional means seem impossible. Their dream had become a notorious local landmark, a piece of dark suburban folklore. For 2 years, the house at 657 Boulevard sat mostly empty, a beautiful shell haunted by the specter of the watcher. In 2016, the Broadduses made another attempt to sell the property. This time, they listed it at a significant loss, hoping a lower price might entice a buyer brave enough to take on the house's disturbing history. But again, The chilling story attached to the address scared away potential owners. The family's lawsuit against the previous owners, the Woods family, was also eventually dismissed by a judge, leaving the Broadduses with mounting legal fees and no recourse. It was during this period of intense stress that another strange and disturbing event occurred. Derek Broaddus, continuing his own relentless investigation, began to focus on a new theory. He wondered if the watcher was someone who had not just lived in the neighborhood, but had perhaps grown up in the house itself, someone with a deep, proprietary, and twisted connection to the property. He and his private investigator began to look into the history of every family that had ever lived at 657 Boulevard. This led them to a family who had lived there in the 1960s. The children of that family were now adults, and one of them, a man who still lived in the area, suffered from schizophrenia. This seemed like a promising, if tragic, lead. Could he, in a state of delusion, believe the house was still his and be lashing out at the new owners? The private investigator arranged to interview the man, but he denied any involvement, and there was no evidence to link him to the letters. It was another dead end. The break for the Broaddus family finally came not from the police or their own investigation, but from a simple act of desperation. In 2016, they found a family who was willing to rent the house. The new tenants were aware of the letters but were not deterred, perhaps believing the story was exaggerated or that the threat had passed. For a time, it seemed like a solution. The rental income helped to offset the crushing mortgage payments, and the presence of a family living in the house brought a sense of normalcy back to the property. But the watcher was not finished. 2 weeks after the new tenants moved in, another letter arrived. This one was delivered to Derek and Maria Broaddus, not to the house itself. It was the most menacing and unhinged letter to date. The author was furious that the Broadduses had rented the house out and seemed to be threatening direct, violent action. "You wonder who the watcher is?" the letter seethed. "Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher is. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move." The letter continued, its threats becoming more specific and terrifying. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away. You are despised by the house. And the watcher won. The letter ended with a final, chilling inventory of potential fates for the family. The arrival of this fourth letter, years after the first, proved that the watcher's obsession had not faded. The new tenants, upon learning of the renewed threat, immediately broke their lease and moved out. The house at 657 Boulevard was empty once more. The case had become an albatross around the neck of the Westfield Police Department and the county prosecutor's office. In 2018, the prosecutor's office announced that after a long and exhaustive investigation, they were closing the case. They had investigated every plausible lead, interviewed numerous individuals, and pursued every theory, but they had been unable to identify a suspect or gather enough evidence to press charges. They had even sent a saliva sample from one of the envelopes for DNA analysis, which came back pointing to a woman, but it was not a definitive match to any of the neighbors they had samples for. The official investigation was over. The watcher had, as they had boasted, won. Finally, in 2019, 5 years after they had purchased their dream home, the Broaddus family managed to sell 657 Boulevard. They sold it for just over $950,000, taking a financial loss of more than $400,000, not including the immense costs of renovations, property taxes, and private investigators. They sold it to a young family who was aware of the home's history, but was determined to move forward and not live in fear. To date, the new owners have not reported receiving any letters. The identity of the watcher remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the digital age. The case has become a modern urban legend, a story that perfectly captures the anxieties of suburban life, the fear of the unknown neighbor, the illusion of safety, and the vulnerability of our most private spaces. The theories continue to swirl. Was it a neighbor, driven by jealousy, mental illness, or a fierce opposition to the Broaddus' renovation plans? This remains the most likely scenario. The level of detail in the letters suggests someone with a close, physical proximity to the house. Was it a member of a family who had lived in the house long ago? A person with a deep psychological and proprietary obsession with the property? This theory explains the generational timeline mentioned in the first letter. Or was it, as some have speculated, a more complex conspiracy? Some have pointed to the idea that it could have been a group of neighbors working together, trying to scare the family away to prevent the large house from being torn down or falling into the hands of developers. The case of the Watcher House is a chilling study in psychological terrorism. The author of the letters was a master of their craft. They used not a weapon of physical violence, but the power of words and the human imagination to destroy a family's sense of security and turn their dream into a source of unending terror. The Watcher's victory was not in causing physical harm, but in successfully claiming ownership of the house through fear, driving a family away and proving their ultimate control over 657 Boulevard. The Broaddus family has since moved on, trying to rebuild their lives away from the glare of the media and the shadow of the house. But the mystery they left behind endures. Somewhere in the quiet, leafy town of Westfield, a person may still be watching, their secret held tight. The letters may have stopped, but the silence is not one of peace, but of suspense. It is a story that serves as a powerful and unsettling reminder that you can buy a house, but you can never truly know its secrets, or the secrets of the people who are watching from just beyond the fence. The case of the Cokeville Elementary School bombing, the chilling case of the Watcher House, is a story about a fortress under psychological siege, where the threat came from anonymous letters that turned a home into a prison of fear. But some threats are not anonymous whispers. They are loud, public, and born from a twisted ideology that seeks not just to terrorize, but to force a confrontation with the world. This is a story about a different kind of siege, one that took place not over years, but over a few terrifying hours inside the most innocent of sanctuaries, an elementary school classroom. It's a story of a man and a woman who believed they could start a revolution, a story of a bomb, a group of terrified children, and a conclusion that many have described as a literal miracle. Cokeville, Wyoming, is a small, quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. Nestled in a remote valley in the American West, it's a community defined by its close-knit nature, its strong Mormon faith, and a deeply felt sense of safety. In the spring of 1986, Cokeville was a peaceful town where the biggest news was the changing of the seasons. That sense of peace was about to be shattered by the return of a former resident, a man who brought with him a bizarre manifesto and a deadly plan. The man's name was David Young. He had once been the town's only police officer, a position he held for just 6 months in 1979 before being fired for misconduct. Young was intelligent but deeply eccentric, a man with a grandiose sense of self and a growing collection of strange, philosophical, and anti-government beliefs. After leaving Cokeville, he had drifted, eventually meeting a woman named Doris who became his devoted follower and second wife. Together, they developed a bizarre personal philosophy they called the Biggie, a rambling mix of reincarnation, telepathy, and a belief in a coming global apocalypse from which they would lead a new generation of intelligent children into a brave new world. To start their revolution, they needed 2 things: an army of children and a large sum of money. They devised a plan that was both audacious and horrifying. They would return to the one place where David Young had once held power, the small, trusting town of Cokeville. They would take the elementary school hostage, and they would demand a ransom of $2 million for every child inside. On the afternoon of Friday, May 16, 1986, David and Doris Young put their plan into action. They drove a large van filled with guns, supplies, and their primary weapon, a massive, homemade gasoline bomb. The bomb was a complex and terrifying device, built inside a shopping cart. It consisted of a large jug of gasoline connected to a series of blasting caps, batteries, and 2 old-fashioned spring-loaded mousetraps rigged as triggers. It was designed to be incredibly sensitive. A single jostle could set it off, creating a massive fireball that would incinerate anything and anyone nearby. They arrived at Cokeville Elementary School just after 1 p.m. David Young, carrying a handgun, walked into the school office and announced that this was a revolution. He distributed copies of his manifesto, a rambling document titled 0 = Infinity, to the school staff. Meanwhile, Doris went from classroom to classroom, rounding up every student and teacher at gunpoint. She was a strange figure, dressed in a mismatched calico dress and a man's buckskin jacket, her face a mask of nervous energy. She lured some of the younger children by telling them there was a wonderful surprise waiting for them in the first grade classroom. One by one, the classes were herded into that single room. It was a large, brightly decorated classroom, designed for about 30 first graders. Soon, it was packed with 136 children, ranging in age from kindergarten to 6th grade, along with 18 adults, including teachers and school staff. The room was hot, crowded, and filled with a growing sense of confusion and fear. David Young then wheeled in the shopping cart containing the gasoline bomb. He placed it in the center of the room, a terrifying centerpiece to his hostage crisis. He held a string that was tied to one of the triggers, a string that he had attached to his own wrist. If he were to be shot or fall, the trigger would be pulled, and the bomb would detonate. He explained the rules to his captives. They were all part of his new world now. He told the children that they were special, that he had chosen them to be the first generation of a new, more intelligent society. He told them he loved them, and that they were going to a brave new world where he would be their king. The situation inside that classroom was incredibly tense. The children were crying. The teachers were trying desperately to keep them calm. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline from the bomb. The teachers, showing incredible courage and ingenuity, tried to keep the children's minds occupied. They led them in songs, read them stories, and started a prayer circle. They opened the windows to try and dissipate the gasoline fumes, an act that would prove to be critically important. David Young became increasingly agitated. He engaged in a strange, philosophical debate with the teachers, trying to explain his bizarre worldview. He claimed to have the power to resurrect the dead, and that even if the bomb went off, he could bring them all back to life. He was a man completely disconnected from reality, a self-proclaimed prophet holding a room full of children hostage to his own delusions. Outside, the town of Cokeville was in a state of shock and terror. The police had been alerted, and a small local force had surrounded the school, but they were outmatched. They knew about the bomb and the number of hostages. A single wrong move could result in an unimaginable catastrophe. The entire town gathered, parents and relatives of the children inside, standing in helpless, agonizing vigil, their eyes fixed on the windows of the first grade classroom. The standoff continued for 2.5 agonizing hours. Inside the classroom, David Young grew more erratic. He had been negotiating with the police, demanding his $2 million per child ransom. At one point, he decided he needed to speak with the sheriff alone. He handed the string that was attached to the bomb's trigger to his wife, Doris. He then left the classroom and went to a small adjoining bathroom to speak with the police through a window. It was at this moment that the situation reached its breaking point. Doris Young, left alone with the bomb and the 154 hostages, was becoming visibly agitated. The children were growing restless and noisy. It is believed that Doris, perhaps trying to quiet them down or simply making a nervous gesture, accidentally jostled the bomb. She lifted her arm, the one with the string attached to the trigger. The mousetrap snapped shut. What happened next is the part of the story that, for many in Cokeville, defies any rational scientific explanation. The bomb detonated, but it did not create the massive, all-consuming fireball that David Young had designed. Instead of a catastrophic explosion, it was a flash ignition, a sudden, intense burst of fire that shot straight up to the ceiling, followed by a thick, choking cloud of black smoke. The room was plunged into chaos, fire, and darkness. The children were screaming, the teachers were shouting, and the idyllic classroom had become a scene from a nightmare. The revolution had begun, but not in the way David Young had ever imagined. The moment the bomb ignited, the first grade classroom at Cokeville Elementary was transformed into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and terror. The sudden, violent flash of the gasoline fire shot upwards, scorching the ceiling and instantly filling the crowded room with a thick, toxic black smoke that plunged everything into a disorienting darkness. The children, who had been trying to stay quiet just moments before, erupted in screams of panic and pain. The idyllic schoolroom had become a death trap. In the midst of this chaos, the teachers and staff acted with extraordinary heroism. They immediately began pushing and pulling the children towards the large windows that lined the classroom. The windows had been opened earlier to vent the gasoline fumes, a simple act that now became the only path to survival. Teachers began lifting and shoving children out of the windows onto the grass below. A desperate, frantic assembly line of escape. The older children helped the younger ones, pulling them through the smoke-filled room. Outside, parents and first responders who had been keeping a helpless vigil watched in horror as the windows blew out and black smoke billowed from the school. They rushed forward, pulling the burned and terrified children away from the building as they tumbled out onto the lawn. Inside the small bathroom adjoining the classroom, David Young heard the explosion. His revolution had begun, but it was a chaotic inferno, not the controlled event he had envisioned. As smoke poured into the bathroom, he realized his plan had completely failed. He turned his gun on his wife, Doris, who had stumbled into the bathroom after being badly burned in the initial blast, and shot her. Then he turned the gun on himself, ending his own life. The self-proclaimed king of the brave new world died in a small, smoke-filled bathroom. His grand vision reduced to a tragic and violent footnote. Back in the classroom, the escape continued. One teacher, severely burned, repeatedly went back into the smoke to find more children. The fire was intense, but it was primarily concentrated near the bomb's origin point in the center of the room. This allowed a small, crucial pocket of survivable space near the windows. Within minutes, every single one of the 136 children and the 16 other adults had managed to escape the burning room. The scene outside was one of horrific injuries and emotional reunions. The children were covered in soot, many of them suffering from severe burns and smoke inhalation. Ambulances and private cars began a frantic shuttle, rushing the injured to the small local hospital and to larger burn centers in Idaho and Utah. The entire town mobilized, a community united in the face of an unimaginable tragedy. As the smoke cleared and the authorities began to piece together what had happened, a sense of profound astonishment began to settle in. Of the 154 people who had been held hostage in that room with a massive gasoline bomb, only 2 were dead. The perpetrators, David and Doris Young. Every single one of their hostages had survived, while 79 people, mostly children, had sustained injuries, primarily burns, many of them severe. No one else had lost their life. For the deeply religious, predominantly Mormon community of Cokeville, the outcome was nothing short of a miracle. The word miracle began to spread through the town, a term used not just by emotional parents, but by seasoned firefighters, police officers, and medical professionals who had witnessed the scene. They looked at the scorched, blackened classroom, the melted desks and light fixtures, and the remnants of the powerful bomb, and they simply could not reconcile the devastation of the room with the fact that everyone had gotten out alive. The stories that began to emerge from the children themselves only deepened this sense of divine intervention. In the days and weeks that followed, as the children began to process their trauma, many of them began to talk about what they had seen inside the smoke-filled room. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Many children reported seeing beautiful, shining people, dressed in white, standing in the room with them during the chaos. They said these figures, who they identified as angels or deceased relatives, seemed to be protecting them from the flames. One little girl drew a picture of her angel, a woman with long hair who had stood in the corner of the room. She claimed the angel told her to go to the window and not be afraid. Another child, who had been standing very close to the bomb when it went off, later told her parents that just before the explosion, a beautiful lady had appeared and told her to stand by the wall, moving her away from the point of ignition. Many children reported seeing a ring of light or a bubble of protection that seemed to form around them, shielding them from the intense heat of the fire. These stories were not just isolated accounts. Dozens of children reported similar experiences. They spoke of feeling a sense of peace amidst the terror, of being guided by unseen hands towards the windows. They described deceased grandparents appearing and leading them to safety. For the community of Cokeville, these were not the fanciful imaginations of traumatized children. They were first-hand testimonies of a miracle. They believed that God and their ancestors had intervened, creating a protective shield in that classroom and leading their children to safety. Investigators and explosives experts, while not able to comment on the supernatural, were also at a loss to explain the outcome from a purely scientific standpoint. They determined that the bomb had malfunctioned. Only one of the 5 blasting caps had detonated, and the gasoline had ignited in a flash fire rather than a full, concussive explosion. If the bomb had detonated as David Young had designed it to, it would have created a massive fireball and a pressure wave that would have instantly killed everyone in the room and likely leveled that wing of the school. Why had it malfunctioned? Was it a flaw in Young's bomb-making skills? Or was it something else? The open windows, which had vented some of the gasoline fumes, were credited with preventing a more catastrophic explosion. But even that did not fully account for the miraculous survival of every single hostage. The bomb experts could explain what happened, but they struggled to explain why. The story of the Cokeville Elementary School bombing became a powerful local legend, a story of faith, heroism, and what many believe to be divine providence. The town did not crumble under the weight of the trauma. Instead, they rallied together, supporting the families of the injured and working to heal the deep psychological wounds left by the event. The school was repaired, and the children eventually returned to their classrooms forever, changed but also bound together by their shared, extraordinary experience. The case stands as a unique and fascinating moment in the annals of true crime. It is a story that began with a dark, twisted ideology and a plan for mass murder, but it did not end in the tragedy that was intended. Instead, it became a story of survival against impossible odds. Whether one chooses to explain that survival through the lens of science, a faulty wire, an open window, a lucky malfunction, or through the lens of faith, a circle of angels, a divine intervention, the outcome remains the same. On a day when a town's worst nightmare came true, every single one of its children came home. The brave new world that David Young had envisioned ended in fire and smoke. But the community of Cokeville, through courage, heroism, and what they believed to be a miracle, endured. In the weeks and months following the Cokeville Elementary School bombing, the town embarked on the long and difficult process of healing. The physical scars, the painful burns that many of the children endured, would eventually begin to fade, but the psychological and spiritual impact of the event would become a permanent part of the community's identity. The story of what happened on May 16, 1986, was not just a story of a crime. It became a foundational local legend, a testament to the town's resilience and a source of profound, shared faith. The law enforcement investigation into the event itself was relatively straightforward. With the perpetrators, David and Doris Young, dead at the scene, there was no one left to prosecute. The primary focus of the investigation was to understand the why and to ensure that there were no other co-conspirators. Investigators delved deep into David Young's past, unearthing his bizarre manifesto, 0 = infinity, and interviewing the few friends and family members he had. They pieced together a picture of a man whose intelligence was tragically corrupted by a narcissistic personality disorder and a messianic complex. He was a man who had appointed himself a philosopher king and saw the kidnapping and ransom as a legitimate, even noble, means to fund the creation of his new world order. Doris, his wife, was seen as a tragic figure in her own right, a devoted follower who had become so enmeshed in his delusional worldview that she was willing to participate in a monstrous act. The investigation concluded that they had acted alone. The true legacy of the Cokeville bombing, however, lies not in the criminal investigation, but in the collective experience of the survivors. The stories of supernatural intervention, of angels and deceased relatives appearing in the smoke-filled classroom, became a cornerstone of the town's recovery. These were not tales that were dismissed or rationalized away. They were embraced. The local LDS, Mormon, church held special meetings where children and teachers could share their experiences without fear of ridicule. For the community, these accounts were not just comforting stories. They were evidence. They were proof that they had not been alone in that room, that a higher power had intervened to protect their children from a fate that, by all rational measures, should have been certain. This narrative of a miracle became a powerful tool for healing. It allowed the survivors to frame their traumatic experience not just as a story of terror and survival, but as a story of faith affirmed. The book The Cokeville Miracle, which compiled the first-hand accounts of the survivors, became a local bestseller and a touchstone for the community. In 2015, the story was adapted into a feature film, further cementing its place in the wider cultural consciousness as a story of divine intervention. Of course, there are more secular and psychological explanations for the children's experiences. Skeptics and psychologists would argue that the angels were likely a form of collective hallucination, a coping mechanism created by minds under extreme, life-threatening stress. In a terrifying, chaotic, and smoke-filled environment, it is easy for the brain to misinterpret sensory information. The figures in white could have been firefighters in protective gear or simply tricks of the light seen through the swirling smoke. The feeling of being guided or protected could be the result of adrenaline and the powerful, instinctual drive to survive. For a community so deeply rooted in faith, it is natural that their interpretation of these chaotic events would be framed in a religious context. But for the people of Cokeville, such rationalizations miss the point. They do not deny the scientific facts of the event: the open windows, the faulty wire on the bomb, the flash ignition. Instead, they see these coincidences as the very mechanisms of the miracle itself. They believe that a higher power worked through these physical means to produce an outcome that defied the odds. The fact that Doris Young, a woman who had never handled the bomb before, was the one to accidentally trigger it, and did so in a way that caused a malfunction, is seen as a key part of that intervention. The heroism of the teachers also cannot be overstated. Figures like teacher Janelle Dayton and music teacher John Miller, who led the charge in getting the children out, are revered as local heroes. Their quick thinking, their courage under fire, and their profound dedication to their students were instrumental in the survival of every child. The story of Cokeville is as much a testament to human courage as it is to faith. The miracle was enacted by ordinary people who did extraordinary things in an impossible situation. The town of Cokeville has never tried to forget what happened. Instead, they have integrated it into their history. The bombing is a part of who they are, a defining moment that tested their faith and their community and found them strong. The survivors, many of whom still live in or around the Cokeville area, have grown up to become parents and grandparents themselves, passing the story down to a new generation. They are forever bound together by the shared trauma and the shared miracle of that day. The case of the Cokeville Elementary School bombing stands as a unique outlier in the dark world of true crime. It is a story that begins with a plot of incredible darkness and depravity, but ends with a narrative of overwhelming light and hope. It is a rare instance where the intended tragedy was averted, where the story is not about the victims who were lost, but about the survivors who were saved. It forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding. We can analyze the faulty wiring, calculate the explosive potential of the gasoline, and study the psychology of David Young. But for many, these scientific explanations will never fully capture the profound sense of wonder and gratitude that permeates the Cokeville story. It remains a case where the evidence of what didn't happen is almost more powerful than the evidence of what did. The 154 people who walked out of that burning room defied the logic of the bomb maker and the grim statistics of such events. Whether by a flaw in a wire, the courage of a teacher, a breath of fresh air from an open window, or the intervention of an angel, the result is the same. A story of survival that continues to inspire and to mystify. A small town in Wyoming that faced down a nightmare and came through it, scarred but whole, with a story that they will forever call a miracle. The disappearance of the Scilly Isles diplomat. The Cokeville bombing is a story about a community facing down a tangible, explosive threat and finding salvation. But some threats are not so clear. They are quiet, personal, and seem to emerge from the very landscape itself. This is a story about a man at the height of his power and influence, a seasoned diplomat who vanished not from a war zone or a city of spies, but from one of the most serene and isolated places imaginable, a tiny, windswept island off the coast of England. It's a case that begins as a simple missing persons report and spirals into a mystery of Cold War politics, potential defections, and the strange, disorienting power of a remote and ancient place. This is the confounding disappearance of Dr. V.H. Donathorn. The Isles of Scilly in the early 1950s were a place apart from the rest of Britain, lying nearly 30 miles off the southwestern tip of Cornwall. This small archipelago of islands is known for its rugged beauty, its subtropical climate, and its profound sense of isolation. It is a world of granite cliffs, white sand beaches, and a close-knit community of sailors and flower farmers. It feels like a place at the very edge of the world, a perfect sanctuary from the pressures of modern life. It was to this remote sanctuary that Dr. Vivian Holt Donathorne came in the spring of 1951. Dr. Donathorne was not a typical tourist. He was a distinguished and highly respected figure in the British Foreign Office. At 60 years old, he was a man with a long and storied career as a diplomat. He was a China hand, one of Britain's foremost experts on Chinese language and culture. He had served as the consul general in several major Chinese cities before and during the Second World War. Most recently, he had been the British consul general in Seoul, South Korea, where he and his staff had been taken prisoner by the advancing North Korean army at the start of the Korean War in 1950. He had spent months as a prisoner of war, enduring harsh conditions before being released. He was a man who had looked into the face of international conflict and survived. Upon his return to England, he was hailed as a hero, but the experience had taken its toll. He was exhausted both physically and mentally. He decided to take a long, restorative holiday before his next diplomatic posting. He chose the Isles of Scilly for its peace and quiet. He checked into the new inn on the island of St. Mary's, the largest of the islands, and settled in for a period of solitary walking and birdwatching. For the first few days, his stay was uneventful. He was a quiet, solitary figure, often seen hiking the coastal paths with his binoculars, a typical English gentleman enjoying the countryside. He kept to himself, but he was always polite to the hotel staff and other guests. On the morning of Sunday, May 20th, 1951, he had breakfast at the inn and mentioned to the staff that he was planning to take a walk to the western side of the island to a place called Panini's Head, a dramatic granite headland known for its stunning views and its treacherous cliffs. He borrowed a book from the hotel library, a biography of Queen Victoria, and set off on his walk around 10 a.m. He was wearing a tweed jacket and flannel trousers. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen him. When Dr. Donathorne did not return to the inn for dinner that evening, the staff became concerned. This was out of character for the punctual diplomat. When he still hadn't returned by the next morning, they alerted the local police. A search was immediately organized. The island of St. Mary's is small, only about 2.5 square miles, and the community is close. A missing person is a major event. The search party, made up of police and local volunteers, began to scour the coastal paths and the rugged terrain around Panini's Head. They soon found the first clue. On a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, they found the book he had borrowed from the hotel, the biography of Queen Victoria. It was lying open, as if he had stopped to read and admire the view. A short distance away, they found his camera case, empty. Of the camera itself and of Dr. Donathorne, there was no sign. The immediate and most logical theory was that he had suffered a tragic accident. The cliffs at Panini's Head are notoriously dangerous. The paths are narrow, and the granite rocks can be slippery. It seemed highly likely that he had lost his footing while taking a photograph or admiring the view, and had fallen into the turbulent Atlantic waters below. This was a sad but simple explanation. The search was expanded to include boats, which scoured the coastline for any sign of a body, but they found nothing. The case remained a simple, albeit tragic, missing persons case for a few days. But then, details from Dr. Donathorne's professional life began to surface, and the story took on a far more complex and sinister tone. This was not just any tourist who had fallen from a cliff. This was a high-level British diplomat who had just been released from a North Korean prisoner of war camp. He was a man who held state secrets, a man who had operated in the murky world of international espionage during the height of the Cold War. Suddenly, the accident theory began to look less certain. The British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, became quietly involved in the investigation. They began to explore other possibilities. Was it possible that Dr. Donathorne's disappearance was not an accident, but was connected to his work? One theory that emerged was that he had been abducted by foreign agents. Could Soviet or Chinese intelligence have tracked him to the remote Isles of Scilly? Perhaps they believed he possessed information that was valuable to them, or perhaps they simply wanted to eliminate a knowledgeable Western diplomat. The idea of a clandestine snatch operation on a tiny British island seemed like something from a spy novel, but in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, it was not outside the realm of possibility. A small boat could have approached the coast at Panini's Head, and a team of agents could have abducted him, leaving behind a few items to stage the scene as an accident. An even more startling theory began to circulate within intelligence circles, that Dr. Donathorn had not been abducted, but had defected. This was the era of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, a time when high-ranking members of the British establishment were being exposed as Soviet moles. The idea of a prominent diplomat turning was a very real and present fear. Had Donathorn made a prearranged rendezvous at Panini's Head? Had he been picked up by a submarine or a foreign vessel and spirited away behind the Iron Curtain? His recent experience as a POW was re-examined. Had he been turned by his captors in North Korea? Had he been broken psychologically and convinced to switch his allegiance? This theory was deeply troubling to the British government. The idea of a hero diplomat being a traitor was a potential scandal of massive proportions, but there were details that seemed to support it. The fact that his body was never found was significant. The Atlantic currents around the Isles of Scilly are strong, but they often wash bodies back ashore. The complete absence of his remains was statistically unusual for a simple drowning. The investigation was now split between three competing narratives: a tragic accident, a sinister abduction, or a shocking act of treason. The local police were left to search the cliffs and the sea, while in the corridors of power in London, a much quieter and more secret investigation was underway, one that was looking not for a body, but for a traitor. The disappearance of Dr. V.H. Donathorn had become more than just a missing persons case. It was a potential international incident, a mystery whose solution was tangled up in the shadowy geopolitics of the Cold War. The quiet, windswept island had become the unlikely stage for a real-life spy thriller. The competing theories surrounding the disappearance of Dr. Vivian Donathorn, tragic accident, enemy abduction, or willing defection, sent the investigation down three very different and often conflicting paths. On the Isles of Scilly, the physical search continued. The local police and volunteer islanders, convinced they were looking for the victim of a terrible accident, spent weeks combing the rugged coastline of St. Mary's. They rappelled down the treacherous granite cliffs of Panini's Head, searching every ledge and crevice. Boats from the Royal National Lifeboat Institution patrolled the surrounding waters, their crews scanning the waves for any sign of a body. The search was thorough and relentless, but it yielded nothing. The sea, it seemed, had swallowed the diplomat whole. Back in London, a much quieter and more clandestine investigation was being conducted by the intelligence services. The possibility that a senior diplomat, a man who had been privy to sensitive information regarding China and the ongoing conflict in Korea, had either been kidnapped by or defected to the enemy was a matter of grave national security. MI5 agents began to meticulously deconstruct Dr. Donathorn's life, searching for any sign of duplicity, any hint of a secret allegiance. They interviewed his colleagues at the Foreign Office, his friends, and his family. The portrait that emerged was of a man who was deeply patriotic, a loyal servant of the crown. He was described as a man of great integrity, the very model of an old-school British diplomat. There was nothing in his personal or professional history to suggest he would be a candidate for treason. He was not known to be in any financial trouble, nor was he susceptible to blackmail. The idea that he had simply thrown away his life and career to defect to the Soviets seemed psychologically improbable. The focus then shifted to his time as a prisoner of war in North Korea. This was the most vulnerable period of his life. Had his captors subjected him to sophisticated brainwashing techniques? Had they broken him mentally and recruited him as a sleeper agent, to be activated upon his return to the West? This was a real fear during the Cold War, as the world was just beginning to understand the psychological tactics being employed by communist regimes. MI5 scrutinized the records of his debriefing upon his release. He had been questioned extensively about his time in captivity, and he had given no indication of any ideological shift. He had, by all accounts, resisted his captor's propaganda with the quiet fortitude expected of a British diplomat. The Manchurian Candidate theory, while a compelling plot for a spy thriller, seemed to have no basis in fact. This left the theory of abduction. Could a team of Soviet or Chinese agents have really pulled off a covert operation on a small British island? While it seemed far-fetched, it was not impossible. The Isles of Scilly, due to their remote location, were not heavily policed or monitored. A foreign submarine could have surfaced off the coast under the cover of darkness or fog, dispatched a small team in a raft to a secluded cove near Panini's Head, and then extracted both the team and their target without being detected. It would have been a high-risk operation, but for a high-value target like Donathorn, the risk might have been deemed acceptable. This theory, however, also had its problems. If he had been abducted, why? If they wanted information from him, they could have tried to get it while he was a prisoner in Korea. If they simply wanted to eliminate him, there were surely easier and less conspicuous ways to do so than a complex amphibious snatch operation. And why leave the book and the camera case behind? The scene seemed to point more to a man who had stopped to rest, not a man who was ambushed in a violent struggle. With the intelligence investigation hitting a wall, the most logical and simple explanation, that of a tragic accident, began to reassert itself. The lack of a body, while unusual, was not unheard of. The currents around the Isles of Scilly are powerful and unpredictable. It was entirely possible that his body had been swept far out to sea, or had become trapped in an underwater cave or crevice, beyond the reach of the search teams. The local islanders, who knew the sea and its moods better than anyone, largely held to this belief. To them, this was not a story of spies and submarines. It was another sad tale of a mainlander who did not respect the power of the ocean and the treachery of the cliffs. For years, the case remained in this state of unresolved limbo. Officially, Dr. Donathorn was listed as a missing person, presumed deceased by accident. But unofficially, the file remained open in the archives of MI5, a lingering question mark. The story faded from the public memory, becoming just another strange footnote in the long history of the Cold War. Then, decades later, a new piece of information emerged that cast the entire case in a new and even more mysterious light. It did not come from a declassified government file or a deathbed confession, but from a local historian on the Isles of Scilly who was researching the case. He uncovered a detail that had been overlooked or dismissed in the original investigation. He learned that on the very day that Dr. Donathorn disappeared, a local fisherman had reported seeing a strange, unmarked vessel, possibly a small submarine or a fast patrol boat, lurking in the waters just off the coast of St. Mary's. The sighting was fleeting, and at the time it had been dismissed as insignificant. But in the context of Donathorn's disappearance, it suddenly seemed incredibly significant. Was this the vessel that had picked him up, either as a willing defector or a captive? The sighting was never officially confirmed, but it added a tantalizing piece of circumstantial evidence to the espionage theories. The case was also re-examined through the lens of Dr. Donathorn's psychological state. While he was not believed to be suicidal, his friends did admit that he was suffering from a form of what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from his time as a prisoner of war. He was gaunt, exhausted, and emotionally reserved. Is it possible that on his solitary walk, surrounded by the vast and indifferent sea, he experienced a sudden and overwhelming psychological break? He could have become disoriented, or been seized by a sudden, irrational impulse. The sea, for a man who had been held captive for so long, could have represented a final, powerful form of escape. In this tragic scenario, his death was not an accident in the traditional sense, but a final, sad consequence of the trauma he had endured. The disappearance of Vivian Donathorn is a mystery that perfectly encapsulates the paranoia and uncertainty of the Cold War era. It is a story where every plausible explanation is undermined by a contradictory detail. If it was an accident, where is the body? If it was an abduction, what was the motive? If it was a defection, what was the evidence of his betrayal? And if it was a suicide, what was the final trigger? He was a man who lived his life in the world of secrets, and it seems that in the end, he became a secret himself. He walked out of his hotel on a quiet Sunday morning for a walk along the cliffs and simply stepped out of the world, leaving behind only a book, an empty camera case, and a mystery that has endured for over 70 years. The granite cliffs of Panini's Head hold the answer, but they have remained silent, guarding the final secret of the Scilly Isles diplomat. The case of Dr. Vivian Donathorne, despite officially being classified as a presumed accidental death, has never truly been laid to rest. The tantalizing threads of espionage and the sheer improbability of a man of his stature simply vanishing have kept the mystery alive in the minds of historians, intelligence analysts, and amateur sleuths. The file, though inactive, remains a fascinating case study in the challenges of investigating a disappearance when the victim is a keeper of state secrets. In the years following the official conclusion of the search, the British government quietly took steps that seemed to hint at their own uncertainty. While the public story remained one of a tragic accident, internally, the Foreign Office and MI5 treated the case with a level of seriousness that suggested they were not entirely convinced. A discreet but thorough vetting of other diplomats who had served in similar high-risk posts was undertaken, a quiet search for any other potential signs of instability or foreign influence. The disappearance had sent a chill through the establishment, a reminder of their vulnerability. The theory of defection, while never publicly acknowledged, continued to be a source of quiet debate within intelligence circles. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of the Cold War defector. High-profile figures like Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, had successfully fled to the Soviet Union, causing immense embarrassment to the British government. In this climate, the possibility that another senior figure had gone over could never be entirely dismissed. If Donathorne had defected, it would have been a masterstroke of intelligence for the Soviets or the Chinese. They would have gained a valuable asset with intimate knowledge of British diplomatic strategy in Asia, and the British would be left with the perfect cover story of an accidental death, allowing the treachery to go undiscovered. However, a crucial piece of this theory has always been missing: the aftermath. In every other major defection case of that era, the defector was eventually revealed, often paraded by their new handlers for propaganda purposes. Donathorne, if he did defect, was never heard from again. He never appeared in Moscow or Beijing. This lack of a reveal makes the defection theory significantly weaker than others. This leaves the theory of abduction as the most compelling alternative to the accident scenario. If foreign agents had taken him, they would have had no reason to reveal his capture. He would have been taken to a secret location, interrogated for the information he possessed, and then likely eliminated. This would explain his complete and total silence. The unconfirmed sighting of the strange vessel off the coast on the day he disappeared remains the most powerful piece of circumstantial evidence to support this narrative. It provides a plausible mechanism for his extraction from the island. The operation would have been incredibly risky, but the potential intelligence gains from debriefing a man like Donathorne could have been seen as worth the risk. As the decades passed, the human element of the story began to fade. Donathorne had no wife or children. His colleagues from the Foreign Office retired and passed away. The case became less of a personal tragedy and more of a historical puzzle, a piece of Cold War lore. The files held by MI5 and the Foreign Office remain classified, and it is likely that they contain details and assessments that have never been made public. The full extent of the government's investigation and their ultimate conclusions are secrets that are still being kept. Today, the story of Dr. Donathorne is largely forgotten by the general public, but it remains a subject of fascination for those interested in the history of espionage. It is a case that perfectly illustrates the concept of the wilderness of mirrors, the disorienting world of intelligence and counterintelligence, where truth and deception are deliberately blurred. Every fact in the Donathorne case can be interpreted in at least two different ways. The borrowed book and empty camera case can be seen as the mundane artifacts of a walk interrupted by a tragic fall, or as carefully placed props in a staged scene designed to mislead. His recent trauma as a POW can be seen as the psychological trigger for a tragic suicide, or as the very experience that made him a prime target for enemy recruitment or abduction. The Isle of St. Mary's has changed little since 1951. The granite cliffs of Panini's Head still stand, lashed by the Atlantic winds. Tourists still walk the same coastal paths that Dr. Donathorne walked on his final morning. The story is now a part of the island's folklore, a strange tale told to visitors about the diplomat who vanished. It is a story that has become one with the landscape itself, a mystery as deep and as inscrutable as the surrounding sea. Ultimately, the disappearance of Dr. Vivian Holt Donathorne is a void. He was a man who navigated the complex and dangerous world of international politics, only to vanish from one of the most peaceful and isolated spots on Earth. He was either the victim of a simple, tragic accident, a fate that befalls many who underestimate the power of the sea, or he was a pawn in a much larger game, a secret casualty of the Cold War. Without a body, a confession, or a declassified file that tells the whole story, we are left only with the quiet, unsettling ambiguity. The case serves as a powerful reminder that even in places of great beauty and tranquility, the long, shadowy arms of global conflict and human intrigue can reach, and that sometimes a man can simply walk to the edge of a cliff and disappear, taking all of his secrets with him. The case of the Georgia Tan baby farms, the disappearance of the diplomat from the Isles of Scilly, is a story about a single, powerful man vanishing into a world of state secrets. But some of the most profound crimes are not about a single person. They are systemic, insidious, and prey on the most vulnerable members of society. This is a story about a woman who built an empire not on money or politics, but on stolen children. It's a story about a crime that was not hidden in the shadows, but was perpetrated in plain sight for decades, sanctioned by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. This is the horrifying, heartbreaking story of Georgia Tan and the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Memphis, Tennessee, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, was a city grappling with the immense social pressures of the era. Poverty, class divides, and limited opportunities, particularly for single women. It was in this environment that a woman named Georgia Tan arrived and saw not a social crisis, but an opportunity. Tan was an intelligent, formidable, and politically connected woman. In 1924, she was given control of the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, a state-chartered but privately run adoption agency. On the surface, it was a respectable, charitable organization, dedicated to finding loving homes for unwanted and orphaned children. But behind its benevolent facade, Georgia Tan was building a black market baby empire. The operation was a sophisticated and horrifyingly simple system of human trafficking, built on a foundation of lies, coercion, and the exploitation of the powerless. Tan's primary targets were poor, single mothers, women who often gave birth in charity wards at local hospitals. These women were at their most vulnerable, often young, uneducated, and with no family support. Tan and her network of spotters, which included doctors, nurses, and social workers, would identify these women and then descend upon them. They would use a variety of cruel tactics to separate the mothers from their children. Sometimes, they would tell a new mother that her baby had died during childbirth, when in fact the healthy infant had already been whisked away to the Tennessee Children's Home. Other times, they would use intimidation and legal trickery. A mother would be visited by a well-dressed woman claiming to be from the state, who would tell her that she was an unfit parent and that if she didn't sign the adoption papers immediately, the state would take her child and she would never see them again. The mothers, terrified and confused, would often sign documents they couldn't read, relinquishing all legal rights to their children. Tan didn't just target single mothers. She also preyed on poor, married couples. A child might be taken to the hospital for a minor illness, and the parents would be told the child needed to stay for an extended period. When they returned, they would be informed that their child had died or that they had been taken into state custody due to neglect. Tan had powerful allies who helped her perpetrate these frauds. She had judges in her pocket, like the local juvenile court judge Camille Kelly, who would rubber stamp her fraudulent custody orders without question. She had doctors who would falsify birth certificates and death certificates. She had created a closed, corrupt system where she was the absolute authority. Once the children were in her possession at the Tennessee Children's Home, they entered a world of institutional neglect and abuse. The conditions at the home were horrific. The children were often malnourished, warehoused in cramped, unsanitary conditions, and cared for by an underpaid and often cruel staff. The mortality rate was staggering. It is estimated that as many as 500 children died in her care over the years due to neglect, abuse, and a lack of proper medical attention. These deaths were covered up, the bodies often buried in unmarked graves. For the children who survived, a different fate awaited them. They were not being placed in loving homes for charitable reasons. They were being sold for profit. Georgia Tann was running a high-end, black-market adoption agency for wealthy, often childless, couples from across the country. She understood the power of marketing. She would place advertisements in newspapers in cities like New York and Los Angeles, offering beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies for adoption. She knew that these couples were desperate for a child and were willing to pay a premium for a quick, discreet, and legally airtight adoption. The process was a transaction. A wealthy couple would travel to Memphis. They would meet with the charming and sophisticated Georgia Tann, who would present them with a selection of available children. She would fabricate stories about the children's backgrounds, claiming they were the offspring of wealthy, respectable families who had fallen on hard times, a narrative that was far more appealing to her clientele than the truth. The adopting parents would pay a hefty fee, often thousands of dollars, disguised as a donation to the home and to cover legal expenses. Georgia Tann would then use her connections to create a falsified birth certificate, listing the adoptive parents as the birth parents, effectively erasing the child's true identity forever. This system of lies and falsified documents made the adoptions almost impossible to ever challenge or reverse. The real birth mothers, if they ever tried to find their children, would hit a brick wall. There would be no record of an adoption, only a death certificate for their child or a sealed court order that they could not access. The children who were adopted grew up with no knowledge of their true heritage, their medical histories, or their birth families. They were, in essence, stolen identities. For nearly 3 decades, from 1924 until 1950, Georgia Tann operated her baby farm with almost complete impunity. She was a master of political manipulation. She made powerful friends, including Boss Crump, the political machine that controlled Memphis for years. Her connections protected her from any serious investigation. Whispers and rumors about her methods circulated for years, but no one was willing or able to take her on. She presented herself to the public as a pioneering child welfare advocate, a saint who was saving children from a life of poverty and neglect. The local newspapers celebrated her work, and she was seen as a pillar of the community. But behind the facade of charity and respectability was a ruthless and deeply cruel woman who profited from the suffering of others. She built an empire on the tears of desperate mothers and the lives of stolen children. It is estimated that she facilitated the adoption of over 5,000 children during her reign. She became incredibly wealthy, living a lavish lifestyle far beyond the means of a simple social worker. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was not a charity. It was her personal, multi-million-dollar business. The story of her eventual downfall would only come to light at the very end of her life, revealing a scandal so vast and so horrific that it would lead to a complete overhaul of adoption laws across the United States. But for the thousands of families she tore apart, the damage was permanent and irreparable. For 26 years, Georgia Tann reigned as the undisputed queen of a dark empire built on stolen children. Her operation at the Tennessee Children's Home Society was a model of corrupt efficiency, protected by a network of powerful allies and a carefully crafted public image of saintly benevolence. While whispers of her cruel methods and the horrific conditions at her facility circulated among the poor and powerless communities she preyed upon, the official world of Memphis society and politics remained willfully blind. Any complaints that were made to the authorities were mysteriously lost or dismissed, often by the very officials who were on Tann's payroll. The beginning of the end for Georgia Tann came not from a crusading journalist or a determined law enforcement officer, but from the changing political landscape of Tennessee. In 1948, a new governor, Gordon Browning, was elected. Browning was a reformer, and he was not part of the old political machine that had protected Tann for decades. One of his primary goals was to clean up the state's notoriously corrupt social services system. He began to hear the persistent rumors and complaints about the Tennessee Children's Home Society and decided to launch a quiet, state-level investigation. The investigation was led by a determined attorney named Robert Taylor. Taylor began the painstaking process of digging into the adoption records and financial dealings of the Memphis home. What he began to uncover was a staggering pattern of fraud, coercion, and financial malfeasance. He found evidence of falsified documents, of birth certificates being illegally altered, and of massive amounts of money being funneled directly into Georgia Tann's personal bank accounts. He interviewed former employees who told stories of abuse and neglect, and he began to connect the dots between the suspiciously high mortality rate at the home and Tann's criminal enterprise. As Taylor's investigation progressed, Georgia Tann became aware that her ironclad protection was beginning to crumble. Her political allies were losing their power, and for the first time in her career, she was facing a real threat of exposure. The stress began to take a severe toll on her health. She was already in poor physical condition, and the fear of being brought to justice exacerbated her existing ailments. In September of 1950, just as Governor Browning was preparing to go public with the findings of the investigation, Georgia Tann was diagnosed with advanced uterine cancer. The timing was almost poetic. The woman who had built her life on controlling the fates of others was now facing a force she could not manipulate or control. Governor Browning held a press conference in mid-September 1950, and he laid out the horrific details of Tann's operation to a shocked public. He described the black market baby sales, the falsified records, the coercion of birth mothers, and the appalling conditions that had led to the deaths of hundreds of children. He called it a vicious, criminal enterprise and announced that the state was moving to shut down the Tennessee Children's Home Society permanently and would be filing criminal charges against Georgia Tann. The scandal was front-page news across the country. The public was horrified to learn that such a monstrous operation had been allowed to flourish for so long, sanctioned by the very people who were supposed to protect the vulnerable. The story of the baby thief of Memphis became a national sensation. But Georgia Tann would never face a human court. Just 3 days after Governor Browning's press conference, on September 15, 1950, she died in her home from complications of her cancer. She died before a single criminal charge could be filed against her, before she could be forced to answer for the decades of suffering she had caused. Her death was a final, frustrating escape from justice. Her powerful co-conspirators, including Judge Camille Kelly, also largely escaped punishment, either through political maneuvering or by claiming ignorance of the extent of Tann's crimes. The closure of the Tennessee Children's Home Society left behind a legacy of chaos and heartbreak. The state was now faced with the monumental task of trying to unravel the tangled web of thousands of fraudulent adoptions. The home's records were found to be in a state of deliberate disarray. Many files had been destroyed, and those that remained were filled with lies. For the thousands of children who had been adopted through Tann's agency, this meant their true identities were likely lost forever. These children, who became known as the Tann survivors, grew up in their adoptive homes, many of them loving and wonderful, but with a fundamental piece of their identity missing. They had no knowledge of their birth families, their ethnic heritage, or their medical histories. The falsified birth certificates they had been given were legal documents, making it almost impossible for them to ever discover the truth. They were living lives built on a foundational lie. The birth mothers who had been coerced into giving up their children were also left in a state of agonizing limbo. For years, many of them had believed their children were dead. The revelation of the scandal brought a new, complicated form of grief. Their child might still be alive, but they had no way of finding them. The sealed and falsified records created an impenetrable wall between them. The Georgia Tann scandal had a profound and lasting impact on adoption laws in the United States. The case exposed the terrifying lack of regulation and oversight in the private adoption system. In response, states across the country began to pass new laws that made it illegal for adoption agencies to profit from placing children, and that established strict legal procedures for the termination of parental rights. The laws were designed to ensure that a birth mother's consent was informed and voluntary, and to protect the integrity of adoption records. The modern, highly regulated system of adoption in America was, in many ways, built upon the ashes of Georgia Tann's horrific legacy. But for the survivors, the legal changes did little to heal their personal wounds. For decades, they were left in the dark, It wasn't until the 1990s, with the rise of the internet and the advent of DNA testing, that a new movement began. The TAN survivors, now adults in their 50s and 60s, began to find each other online. They formed support groups, shared their stories, and began a collective search for their roots. A key figure in this movement was a woman named Lisa Wingate, whose best-selling novel Before We Were Yours was inspired by the TAN scandal. The book brought the story to a new generation and helped to connect hundreds of survivors. In recent years, organizations like the Tennessee Children's Home Society Victims Group and the use of commercial DNA testing services like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe have allowed hundreds of TAN survivors to finally solve the mystery of their own origins. These DNA tests have led to emotional, often tearful reunions between adopted children, now elderly themselves, and the birth siblings and extended families they never knew they had. Each reunion is a small victory against the vast criminal enterprise of Georgia TAN. A small piece of a stolen history finally being reclaimed. But for every story of a successful reunion, there are thousands more that remain unresolved. A permanent legacy of a woman who treated human lives as a commodity. The legacy of Georgia TAN is a complex and deeply painful one. A story whose shockwaves continue to ripple through thousands of families to this day. While the legal and social reforms that followed the scandal were significant, the human cost of her decades-long operation was immeasurable and, for many, irreparable. Her death in 1950 did not end the story. It simply sealed the secrets of countless stolen identities, leaving a generation of her victims to navigate a lifetime of questions. The story of the TAN survivors is one of profound and often quiet suffering. Many grew up in loving adoptive homes, completely unaware of their true origins. But for a significant number, a sense of otherness or a feeling of being disconnected from their own history was a persistent, nagging presence. The revelation of the TAN scandal, when it came to them later in life, was often a devastating blow, shattering their understanding of who they were. It forced them to confront the fact that their entire life story was built on a foundation of lies, that the parents listed on their birth certificate were not their biological parents, and that they had been, in essence, a purchased commodity. The search for their roots became a central, driving force for many survivors. But for decades, this search was a lonely and frustrating endeavor. The official records were a deliberately constructed labyrinth of falsehoods. The Tennessee Children's Home Society had been shut down, its files sealed by the state in an effort to protect the privacy of the adoptions. An act that, while well-intentioned, had the practical effect of cementing Georgia TAN's lies and keeping the victims from the truth. A survivor might try to obtain their original birth records, only to be met with a legal brick wall. The emotional toll of this search was immense. It was a journey fraught with disappointment and unanswered questions. Many survivors went to their graves without ever knowing the names of their birth parents or the truth of their medical history. The birth mothers, too, lived with a lifetime of unresolved grief. Many had been told their babies had died, and they carried that sorrow with them for decades. The later discovery that their child had, in fact, been stolen and sold was a secondary trauma, a cruel twist that reopened old wounds and left them with a desperate, often futile, hope of reunion. The advent of the internet in the 1990s marked a major turning point. For the first time, TAN survivors were able to find each other. Online forums and support groups became virtual communities where they could share their stories, compare their falsified documents, and realize they were not alone. This collective movement gave them a sense of shared identity and purpose. They were no longer isolated individuals grappling with a private mystery. They were a community of survivors, united in their search for the truth. The real revolution, however, came with the widespread availability of commercial DNA testing. Services like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe provided a scientific tool that could finally bypass the brick wall of Georgia TAN's fraudulent paperwork. A simple saliva sample could connect a survivor to a vast database of genetic information, revealing biological relatives, siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles they never knew existed. In the last decade, this technology has been responsible for hundreds of incredible and deeply emotional reunions. Elderly survivors in their 70s and 80s have been able to meet their biological siblings for the first time. They have learned about their family's history, their ethnic heritage, and the medical conditions that run in their families. These reunions are moments of profound joy and bittersweet discovery. They are a powerful reclamation of a stolen identity, but they are also tinged with the sadness of lost time, of decades of missed relationships and shared experiences that can never be recovered. The legacy of Georgetown is also seen in the legal battles that continue to this day. In recent years, survivor groups have successfully lobbied states like Tennessee to pass new laws that grant adoptees greater access to their original birth records. These legal changes are a direct response to the injustices perpetrated by TAN and are designed to ensure that the right of an individual to know their own identity is prioritized. Some of the more famous individuals who were adopted through TAN's agency have also helped to keep the story in the public eye. Professional wrestler Ric Flair has spoken publicly about his adoption through the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The late actress Joan Crawford also adopted twin daughters through TAN, a fact that highlights the reach of TAN's network into the highest echelons of society. The story of Georgia Tan is a chilling case study in the corrupting influence of power and the terrifying vulnerability of the powerless. She was a woman who exploited a societal need, the desire of childless couples to have a family, and turned it into a monstrous, for-profit enterprise. She operated with impunity for so long because she was protected by a system that was supposed to protect children, a system that she had successfully co-opted through bribery and political influence. Her story serves as a stark and enduring warning about the dangers of unchecked authority in social welfare systems. Ultimately, the case is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unquenchable need to know who we are. The survivors of Georgia Tan's reign of terror were stripped of their names, their families, and their histories, but they were not stripped of their humanity. Their decades-long search for the truth is a powerful act of defiance against the woman who tried to erase them. Each time a family is reunited through a DNA match, it is a small victory against the vast darkness of her crimes. A single, broken thread of a family's history that is finally, after a lifetime, being woven back together. Georgia Tan's empire has long since crumbled to dust, but the search for the children she stole continues. A quiet, persistent, and deeply human quest for the one thing she could never truly take away: the truth. The Freeway Phantom, the horrific case of Georgia Tan, is a story about a crime hidden in plain sight, a systemic abuse of power that unfolded over decades. But some reigns of terror are not so long. They are sharp, brutal, and concentrated. A season of fear that descends upon a city and leaves a permanent, chilling scar. This is a story that takes place in the capital of the United States, a city of immense power and global importance. But it unfolds not in the halls of government, but on the quiet residential streets and forgotten roadsides where a phantom killer hunted the most vulnerable, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and a single, taunting clue that has haunted investigators for half a century. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom. Washington, D.C., in the spring of 1971, was a city of stark and often painful contradictions. It was the seat of global power, a place of gleaming marble monuments and political intrigue. But it was also a city grappling with deep social and racial divides, urban decay, and rising crime rates. For the city's large African-American population, life was often a world away from the postcard images of the National Mall. They lived in close-knit, working-class neighborhoods, communities that were rich in culture and resilience, but were often underserved and overlooked by the city's power structure. It was in these neighborhoods, primarily in the southeast quadrant of the city, that a predator began his silent, terrifying hunt. The story begins on the afternoon of April 25, 1971. 13-year-old Carol Spinks was walking home from a neighborhood grocery store with her older sister. They lived in a large apartment complex, and to get home, they had to cross a busy intersection. Carol's sister made it across the street, but when she turned around, she saw that Carol was still waiting on the other side. She called out to her to hurry up. Carol waved back, indicating she would be right there. Her sister continued on, assuming Carol was just a few steps behind her. It was a simple, everyday moment, a fleeting separation between two sisters on a familiar street. It was the last time Carol Spinks was ever seen alive by her family. When Carol didn't arrive home, her family began to worry. They searched the immediate area, but she was gone. It was as if she had been plucked from the busy street corner in the middle of the afternoon. For 6 agonizing days, her family and the community searched for her, plastering her face on missing posters. Then, on May 1st, a highway worker made a grim discovery. On a grassy embankment next to the Suitland Parkway, a major commuter freeway just across the district line in Maryland, he found the body of a young girl. It was Carol Spinks. The autopsy revealed a brutal and heartbreaking story. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled. Her body had been kept by her killer for several days before being dumped by the side of the freeway, as if she were a piece of trash. The city was horrified. The murder of a child is always a shocking event, but the callousness of this crime sent a particular chill through the community. The Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, launched a homicide investigation, but they had few leads. The crime was random. The victim was a schoolgirl with no known enemies, and the killer had left behind no obvious clues. The city tried to move on, hoping this was an isolated, tragic event. But 2.5 months later, the nightmare returned. On July 8, 1971, another young African-American girl, 16-year-old Darlenia Johnson, went missing. She lived in the same neighborhood as Carol Spinks. She had been sent on a simple errand to a local recreation center and never came back. Her disappearance triggered a wave of fear in the community. The similarities to the Spinks case were too strong to ignore. 11 days later, her body was found. She had been dumped on a roadside embankment, just a few feet away from where Carol Spinks's body had been discovered. She, too, had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The police now knew they were not dealing with an isolated crime. They were hunting a serial killer. The panic in the African-American communities of Southeast DC was palpable. Parents were terrified to let their children walk to school or play outside. The killer seemed to be targeting young girls in their own neighborhoods, abducting them in broad daylight from familiar streets. He was a phantom who could strike with impunity and then vanish. The killer struck again just 10 days later. On July 27th, 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett left her home to go to the corner store to buy bread for her mother. She never returned. Her disappearance was immediately reported, and a desperate search began. The next evening, the Crockett family's phone rang. On the other end of the line was a small, terrified voice. It was Brenda. She was crying. "A white man picked me up, and I'm on my way home in a taxi now," she told her sister. But the call was strange. It sounded as if she was being coached, as if someone was in the room with her, telling her what to say. The line then went dead. A few hours later, her body was found, abandoned in a wooded area near US Route 50. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, just like the others. Her final, cryptic phone call only deepened the mystery and the terror. The police now had 3 victims, all young black girls, all abducted from their neighborhoods, assaulted, strangled, and dumped near a major freeway. The press and the community began to call the unidentified killer the Freeway Phantom. The investigation was massive, but it was plagued by the racial and social tensions of the era. The families of the victims and many in the community felt that the police department, which was predominantly white at the time, was not taking the murders of black children as seriously as they should. They felt that if the victims had been white girls from a wealthy neighborhood, the response would have been far more aggressive. This created a climate of mistrust between the community and the police, which hampered the investigation. The Freeway Phantom struck again in the fall. On September 5th, 12-year-old Nenomoshia Yates was walking home from a grocery store when she disappeared. Her body was found hours later near another major freeway. She had been killed in the same manner as the others. A month later, on October 1st, 18-year-old Brenda Woodard was abducted. She was a student at a local college. Her body was found the next morning. The pattern was horribly, tragically consistent. The city was in the grip of a full-blown panic. The killer was becoming more brazen, the time between abductions and the discovery of the bodies shrinking. The police were under immense pressure to make an arrest. They had a vague description from Brenda Crockett's phone call, a white man. But this was a thin lead in a predominantly black neighborhood. Was she telling the truth, or was she forced to lie by her captor? Then the killer made his most audacious and chilling move. Tucked into the pocket of the final victim, Brenda Woodard, the police found a note. It was handwritten by the victim herself, dictated to her by her killer. The note was a taunting, terrifying message addressed directly to the police and the public. "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women." It began, "I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." The note was a bombshell. The killer had given himself a name. He was not just a murderer. He was a performer, a monster who craved recognition and was reveling in the terror he had created. The note also contained a cryptic and deeply disturbing instruction. He ordered the victim to call her parents and tell them, "I'm in a new world." It was a message of ultimate control, a final, cruel act of psychological torture inflicted on the family. The Freeway Phantom had now killed 5 young women in the span of just 6 months. A 6th victim, 18-year-old Diane Williams, who was murdered in September 1972, is also widely believed to be a victim of the Phantom. Though her case has not been officially linked, the city was terrified. The police had a taunting note, a vague description, and a series of crimes that were as brutal as they were patternistic. They were hunting a phantom who seemed to be able to move through their city like a ghost, a killer who was always one step ahead, and who had now openly challenged them to catch him. The discovery of the taunting note in Brenda Woodard's pocket transformed the Freeway Phantom case from a terrifying series of murders into a direct, psychological duel between the killer and the city of Washington, D.C. The Phantom had a name, a voice, and an almost unbearable arrogance. The note was a gauntlet thrown down, and the Metropolitan Police Department, under immense public and political pressure, scrambled to pick it up. They now had a piece of the killer's mind, a window into his pathology, but it was a dark and twisted view. The note was immediately sent to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for analysis. Profilers determined that the language, using words like tantamount and insensitivity, suggested a killer who was educated, or at least someone who wanted to project an image of intelligence and superiority. The message was a mixture of grandiosity and self-pity, the classic hallmarks of a narcissistic psychopath. The act of forcing the victim to write her own death note was a sign of his absolute need for control and his desire to inflict the maximum amount of psychological pain on the victims and their families. He was not just killing them. He was erasing them and replacing their final words with his own. The investigation now had a new focus, trying to identify the author of the note. Handwriting experts analyzed the script, but because it was written by the victim, it offered no direct clues to the killer's own hand. The most promising lead seemed to be Brenda Crockett's final phone call, where she had stated, "A white man picked me up." This led the police to focus their investigation on potential white suspects who either lived in or frequented the predominantly black neighborhoods where the girls were abducted. This was a difficult and sensitive task, creating even more tension in an already mistrustful community. Many residents found it hard to believe that a white man could repeatedly abduct black children from their own streets without being noticed. This led to a competing theory, that the killer was himself black and had forced Brenda to lie about his race to deliberately mislead the police and sow racial discord. The task force, a massive operation involving over 100 officers, pursued thousands of leads. They stopped and questioned men in cars that fit vague descriptions. They interviewed known sex offenders in the area. The pressure to make an arrest was so intense that several wrongful arrests were made, further damaging the police department's relationship with the community. In the midst of this intense investigation, a group of community activists decided to take matters into their own hands. A local black radio station, WOOK, along with a group of community leaders, raised money to hire their own team of private investigators. This team, which included former police officers, operated in parallel to the official investigation. They believed that the killer was likely a member of the community and that residents might be more willing to talk to them than to the predominantly white police force. This created a unique and sometimes tense situation, with 2 separate investigations running simultaneously. The official police investigation began to zero in on a group of men who were part of a Green Team program. This was a government-funded horticultural program that employed young men, many of them with minor criminal records, to do landscaping work around the city. One of the program's work sites was near the area where several of the victims had been abducted. Investigators theorized that one or more of these men could have used their position to observe and target the young girls. Several members of the Green Team were brought in for questioning and subjected to polygraph tests. One man, in particular, became a primary suspect. He had a history of violence and was known to have been in the area at the times of the abductions. However, a key witness who had seen one of the victims getting into a car could not positively identify him in a lineup. Without a positive ID or any physical evidence, the police were unable to make an arrest. The Green Team theory, like so many others, remained a tantalizing but unproven possibility. After the murder of Brenda Woodard in October 1971, the city held its breath, waiting for the phantom to strike again. But the killings suddenly stopped. The taunting note seemed to be his final, arrogant sign-off. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the murders themselves. Had the killer been arrested for another crime? Had he died? Or had he simply moved away, satisfied with the terror he had created? The case grew cold, but it never truly went away. It became a lingering trauma for the city, a dark chapter in its history that refused to be closed. The families of the 6 victims were left in a state of permanent, unresolved grief. They had lost their daughters to a faceless monster who was never brought to justice. Years later, in the 1980s, a new and startling piece of information emerged. A woman who had been a student at the same college as the final victim, Brenda Woodard, came forward to the police. She told them a story she had been too afraid to tell in 1971. She said that Brenda had recently broken up with a boyfriend who was a Vietnam veteran and that the breakup had not been amicable. She claimed that this ex-boyfriend had been stalking Brenda and had even threatened her. This lead had never been fully explored in the original investigation. The police tried to locate the man, but he had moved away, and the trail was cold. It was another what if, another path not taken in the chaotic initial investigation. The Freeway Phantom case is a tragic case study in the challenges of investigating serial crimes, particularly when they cross jurisdictional and racial lines. The abductions took place in the District of Columbia, but the bodies were dumped in Maryland, creating logistical and communication challenges for the 2 different police departments. The deep-seated mistrust between the African American community and the police force undoubtedly hampered the flow of information. And the forensic science of the early 1970s was a world away from the DNA testing and agitabasing that solves so many cold cases today. The killer operated in a perfect storm of social and technological limitations. Over the last 5 decades, the case has been periodically re-examined by cold case detectives. They have re-interviewed witnesses and looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, but they have never been able to make a definitive breakthrough. The primary suspects from the original investigation have since died, taking their secrets with them. The Freeway Phantom remains a ghost. He is a faceless embodiment of a city's fear, a predator who hunted the most vulnerable and then vanished back into the shadows. The 6 young women he murdered, Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nenomoshia, Brenda, and Diane, are not just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. Young lives full of promise that were brutally extinguished. Their case is a chilling reminder of a time when a phantom could haunt the freeways of the nation's capital. A killer who challenged the city to catch him and then disappeared, leaving behind only a legacy of pain and a question that has echoed through the generations. Who was the Freeway Phantom? The discovery of the taunting note in Brenda Woodard's pocket transformed the Freeway Phantom case from a terrifying series of murders into a direct, psychological duel between the killer and the city of Washington, D.C. The Phantom had a name, a voice, and an almost unbearable arrogance. The note was a gauntlet thrown down, and the Metropolitan Police Department, under immense public and political pressure, scrambled to pick it up. They now had a piece of the killer's mind, a window into his pathology, but it was a dark and twisted view. The note was immediately sent to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for analysis. Profilers determined that the language, using words like tantamount and insensitivity, suggested a killer who was educated, or at least someone who wanted to project an image of intelligence and superiority. The message was a mixture of grandiosity and self-pity, the classic hallmarks of a narcissistic psychopath. The act of forcing the victim to write her own death note was a sign of his absolute need for control and his desire to inflict the maximum amount of psychological pain on the victims and their families. He was not just killing them. He was erasing them and replacing their final words with his own. The investigation now had a new focus, trying to identify the author of the note. Handwriting experts analyzed the script, but because it was written by the victim, it offered no direct clues to the killer's own hand. The most promising lead seemed to be Brenda Crockett's final phone call, where she had stated, "A white man picked me up." This led the police to focus their investigation on potential white suspects who either lived in or frequented the predominantly black neighborhoods where the girls were abducted. This was a difficult and sensitive task, creating even more tension in an already mistrustful community. Many residents found it hard to believe that a white man could repeatedly abduct black children from their own streets without being noticed. This led to a competing theory, that the killer was himself black and had forced Brenda to lie about his race to deliberately mislead the police and sow racial discord. The task force, a massive operation involving over 100 officers, pursued thousands of leads. They stopped and questioned men in cars that fit vague descriptions. They interviewed known sex offenders in the area. The pressure to make an arrest was so intense that several wrongful arrests were made, further damaging the police department's relationship with the community. In the midst of this intense investigation, a group of community activists decided to take matters into their own hands. A local black radio station, WOOK, along with a group of community leaders, raised money to hire their own team of private investigators. This team, which included former police officers, operated in parallel to the official investigation. They believed that the killer was likely a member of the community and that residents might be more willing to talk to them than to the predominantly white police force. This created a unique and sometimes tense situation, with two separate investigations running simultaneously. The official police investigation began to zero in on a group of men who were part of a Green Team program. This was a government-funded horticultural program that employed young men, many of them with minor criminal records, to do landscaping work around the city. One of the program's work sites was near the area where several of the victims had been abducted. Investigators theorized that one or more of these men could have used their position to observe and target the young girls. Several members of the Green Team were brought in for questioning and subjected to polygraph tests. One man, in particular, became a primary suspect. He had a history of violence and was known to have been in the area at the times of the abductions. However, a key witness who had seen one of the victims getting into a car could not positively identify him in a lineup. Without a positive ID or any physical evidence, the police were unable to make an arrest. The Green Team theory, like so many others, remained a tantalizing but unproven possibility. After the murder of Brenda Woodard in October 1971, the city held its breath, waiting for the phantom to strike again. But the killings suddenly stopped. The taunting note seemed to be his final, arrogant sign-off. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the murders themselves. Had the killer been arrested for another crime? Had he died? Or had he simply moved away, satisfied with the terror he had created? The case grew cold, but it never truly went away. It became a lingering trauma for the city, a dark chapter in its history that refused to be closed. The families of the 6 victims were left in a state of permanent, unresolved grief. They had lost their daughters to a faceless monster who was never brought to justice. Years later, in the 1980s, a new and startling piece of information emerged. A woman who had been a student at the same college as the final victim, Brenda Woodard, came forward to the police. She told them a story she had been too afraid to tell in 1971. She said that Brenda had recently broken up with a boyfriend who was a Vietnam veteran and that the breakup had not been amicable. She claimed that this ex-boyfriend had been stalking Brenda and had even threatened her. This lead had never been fully explored in the original investigation. The police tried to locate the man, but he had moved away, and the trail was cold. It was another what if, another path not taken in the chaotic initial investigation. The Freeway Phantom case is a tragic case study in the challenges of investigating serial crimes, particularly when they cross jurisdictional and racial lines. The abductions took place in the District of Columbia, but the bodies were dumped in Maryland, creating logistical and communication challenges for the two different police departments. The deep-seated mistrust between the African American community and the police force undoubtedly hampered the flow of information. And the forensic science of the early 1970s was a world away from the DNA testing and genetic genealogy that solves so many cold cases today. The killer operated in a perfect storm of social and technological limitations. Over the last 5 decades, the case has been periodically re-examined by cold case detectives. They have re-interviewed witnesses and looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, but they have never been able to make a definitive breakthrough. The primary suspects from the original investigation have since died, taking their secrets with them. The Freeway Phantom remains a ghost. He is a faceless embodiment of a city's fear, a predator who hunted the most vulnerable and then vanished back into the shadows. The 6 young women he murdered, Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nenomoshia, Brenda, and Diane, are not just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. Young lives full of promise that were brutally extinguished. Their case is a chilling reminder of a time when a phantom could haunt the freeways of the nation's capital. A killer who challenged the city to catch him and then disappeared, leaving behind only a legacy of pain and a question that has echoed through the generations. Who was the Freeway Phantom?